Hyde. I'm Brian Hyde, and I've got a great topic for today's show. We're going to talk about school choice and how it actually requires real choice, not just a limited, binary choice. You can have vanilla or you can have chocolate, provided by the state, but actually real choice, free of having to go with the public education system. This is going to make some people angry, but that's actually a good thing. And it looks like we may have a very good chance of getting real school choice in Idaho in the upcoming legislative session next year. Stick around and I'll tell you why.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm excited to talk about this topic, not because, I hate public education or I hate education. I just want kids to never go to school. But, to hear the opponents of school choice, you would think that really the only choice we have is we either educate our kids in government-run schools or we don't educate them at all. Now, COVID actually had a silver lining in that it allowed a lot of parents to recognize, maybe some for the first time, that they had a choice. In fact, a lot of parents actually got a glimpse into what their kids were actually being taught when school was being taught by Zoom. And for some parents, it was not a pleasant experience, not a good awakening. They were actually pretty upset about it. So let's talk a little bit about why is there this incredible fear that if we offer the public choice, if there's actual competition in terms of where kids or where parents could send their kids to go to school, you're not just forced to go because of your zip code to, this school or that school. What if they actually had that choice? Why is that so threatening to people who are supportive of the government-run public school system? I want to share with you some pieces from, this is an article by Audrey Dutton. Now, this is talking about what the Republican primary in Idaho generally showed with the way things shook out last month. And she refers to it as a culture war, but school choice was a part of it. And I want you to pay very close attention to the way that she frames many of these issues in many of these debates. Look especially for the scare quotes, because this is supposed to cue you in as to this is stuff you're not supposed to believe. So Audrey starts by telling us that, first of all, the jury on public education is still out, which is true. It's not an issue that everybody agrees, is one size fits all. However, look at this. She says one of the highest profile losses for incumbents was a Boise area Republican who thwarted tax-funded vouchers. Now, vouchers is kind of the catch-all we hate, school choice. Sometimes it's education savings accounts. Sometimes it could be tuition tax credits. It can take other forms than vouchers, but that's that's the cuss word that anti-school choice people use to try to lump it all into one thing, and it cannot be distinguished from another. Truthfully, you talk to people in school choice, they will tell you there are a lot of different choices, and different states have taken different approaches, which is good. We should have a chance to suss this out and see if there are better ways to do this. That would allow parents to send their children to private school using public funds. No, using parents' funds that they pay in as a taxpayer. A central policy goal of right-wing purists, there's a qualifier, she calls them right-wing, who describe it as school choice. Well, what's the alternative? You just keep your kid in the government school and shut up and do what you're told. We're actually going to talk about why that actually is part of the dynamic that drives this thinking. So Julie Yamamoto is who she's talking about. Yamamoto led the Idaho House Education Committee when it rejected what, again, they're calling voucher legislation. Now, this could have been education savings accounts, but again, this is not accurate reporting. It's using scare words to try to stampede people in a predictable direction. Challenger Kent Marmon, who embraces school choice, painted Yamamoto as a liberal. Well, I don't know. Did Yamamoto support things that would typically be supported by more liberal, individuals? A Virginia-based political action committee called Make Liberty Win produced flyers saying Yamamoto voted to support porn in school libraries being shown to minors. That's according to Idaho Education News, a claim that Yamamoto called garbage. Now, look, it's pretty simple. This is not a matter of, yes, they were screening, a showing of Deep Throat or some, 70s porn, in the school library. But the fact of the matter is, were there books offering graphic illustrations, graphic depictions of deviant sexual acts, books that were aimed primarily at children to try to introduce them to whatever it is, their own sexuality or somebody else's sexuality that they're very proud of for some reason? Nonetheless, The answer is yes. These are things that are an issue. And this is something that parents rightly are saying that's not appropriate. And so, yes, Julie Yamamoto, well, we can't limit that because well, first of all, it would go against the teachers' unions. And apparently she's beholden to the teachers' unions in a big way. Nonetheless, back to Audrey's article here. She says the losses for voucher foes like Yamamoto weren't uniform. The Senate's education chair, who's questioned the benefits of voucher proposals, retained his seat. Okay, well, question it, that's fine. But and the Senate lost a key supporter of school choice. I'm going to quit using her term voucher supporter because, again, it encompasses much more than vouchers. In Scott Herndon, the North Idaho Republican, his challenger has spoken out against public support for private education. Look, it's all about, is the money able to follow the student? This is not about supporting a particular system so much as supporting the student. Again, we're supposed to be led to believe that there's only one true way that we can do this, and that is with the public system. Again, according to Idaho Education News. Now, Audrey says it's unclear what outcome portends for Republicans when they take up school spending issues next year. Here's a hint. There's a good likelihood that school choice is going to actually get in front of legislative committees and will very likely advance. In fact, I bet you, I'm not trying to predict the future, but I would be surprised if we don't see some form of school choice passed in the gem state in 2025. Idahoans, she says, regularly list public education as a top priority in sparsely populated areas of Idaho, which often lack private schools. The public schoolhouse is a gathering place for football games or performing arts, the heart of the community, as former Attorney General Jim Jones says. Well, that's not why we send kids to school, though. We send them there to gain an education, to gain the kind of thinking skills that will actually help them be able to be productive members of the society and hopefully support themselves and not be a burden on themselves or taxpayers. So, something to think about there. But she says advocates for, here are the scare quotes, school choice in Idaho appear to be finding an audience. Gee, I wonder why. Again, I have an answer for that coming up in just a moment. Now, Audrey reports a recent state policy survey found 60% of Republicans favored letting Idaho parents use $8,000. And again, she calls it public school money. It's taxpayer funds. It does not belong to the public schools. It belongs to the taxpayers. And if the public schools, just, hear me out on this, if they weren't delivering what they promised to deliver, why shouldn't the parents whose students' education is at stake here be able to take some of that money and put it toward education that actually gets their student what they need, especially if they can do it for less than what the public schools are spending to try to get the same result and failing to do? Well, about twice as many Republicans said they strongly favor that idea as strongly oppose it. Now, again, I'm going to ask you, why would parents want to pull their kids out of public schools? I mean, there are a number of different reasons, and for some parents and for some students, the government-run school might be the best possible fit, but that doesn't mean it's right for everybody. And then you get things that come along that kind of confirm, yeah, for some parents, maybe it's just not what I want my kids being taught. Maybe there's some hidden agendas that are being pushed. Oh, for instance, look at this, U.S. Department of Education, which, by the way, works closely with those public schools funded with taxpayer money. It's not public money. It's taxpayer money. Okay, the government doesn't create it. It has to confiscate it from people. And you should never forget that relationship because it means there needs to be accountability. So here's the U.S. Department of Education, in case you hadn't noticed, it's Pride Month, and they're telling us every student should feel safe attending school in America, free from discrimination and valued for who they are, assuming that their sexuality is the sum total of who they are. That means creating and welcoming safe learning environments for every LGBTQI plus student and ensuring legislators have resources to support LGBTQI plus young people. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like an agenda. And the kind of agenda that, again, some parents are going to say, that's not why I'm sending my kid to school. I don't necessarily want my child to come home, questioning their sexuality. Look, everybody develops at a different rate. There are different topics and different ideas that kids just aren't equipped to handle. You gain that maturity as you go through life. We don't need somebody with an agenda swooping in and using a compelled kind of education, which is what public education is. But again, this is not something that's very well understood because most people don't understand. How did we get public education? So let's do a real quick history lesson. In the 1840s, Horace Mann, who was the superintendent of Boston's public schools, traveled to Prussia, Okay, that would be what we call Germany today. And he wanted to study their school systems because he wanted to see how can we make a school system that produces that could deal with what he called unruly students. Now he meant independent students, students who think a little too independently. He wanted some uniformity in the kind of students and citizens that they were able to produce. These were the goals of what the Prussian school system was supposed to produce. Number one, obedient workers for the mines. Number two, obedient soldiers for the army. Number three, well-subordinated civil servants to government. Number four, well-subordinated clerks to industry. And number five, citizens who thought alike about major issues. Any of that ring true in our day? I mean, it sure seems like it, because that's where kids are trained. Well, we all got to think this way, and if anybody deviates, for instance, if a young man in North Idaho prior to graduation says boys are boys and girls are girls, and there is no in between, why, it's our duty to punish him and prevent him from walking for graduation because we all have to think the same way. Now, going on with this is from John Taylor Gatto. Unfortunately, he has passed away, but this was the Educator of the Year in New York City back in the early 1990s. His underground history of American education describes how that public school system came to America. John Taylor Gatto says a small number of passionate ideological leaders visited Prussia in the first half of the 19th century, fell in love with the order, obedience, and efficiency of its educational system, and campaigned relentlessly thereafter to bring the Prussian version to our shores. Now, to do that, children would have to be removed from their parents and inappropriate cultural influences. That would mean church as well. So that's what happened. The next step was to sell the new system to the public in the name of equality by convincing each respective state as they came into the Union to adopt a compulsory government school system to ensure a uniform education for the masses. Now, the primary goals of this system were not intellectual training, but rather conditioning the students for obedience, subordination, and the collective life. Now, with this bit of historical perspective regarding the origins and the stated intentions of public education, it's a lot easier to understand why a free education for all children in public schools was actually a key plank of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Now, if you don't believe me, I would encourage you to look it up for yourself. Prove me wrong. It's in there. It's one of the planks. I want to share a couple of quotes with you as well that also drive this home. This is from Sheldon Richman from I believe it's the Future of Freedom Foundation, who says, many of us grow up believing that government reflects the will of the people, but skeptics know better. Government has assumed more and more control over private life, not because the people demanded it, but because power seekers and privilege seekers sought outlets for their ambitions. Then they propagandized the public until a sufficient number of people came to believe that government control was good for them. You see this so clearly in school choice battles because it ultimately comes down to the people who are just most strongly defending the public school system and saying there cannot be any school choice except what exists within that system are the people who are more trying to support the system. The system for them is a jobs program for teachers or for administrators or librarians or whatever. And the kids, the students are actually kind of a secondary consideration. It's there for the students, or at least it should be, if education really is the goal. If indoctrination is the goal, well then, yeah, you've got a great system that works exactly as it was intended. And again, you can see why parents would want choice. Here's one more quote for your consideration. As writer Karen DeCoster points out, what's most disquieting about the public education mindset is that those who believe most strongly in it are convinced that there are no other noble alternatives, and that the alternatives that do exist are merely a hindrance to the only real education that's provided via the public domain. And that is certainly what you hear when it comes to school choice. So with that in mind, I'd like to share with you a couple of excerpts from Ron Nate from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. First of all, asking why aren't we seeing public, school choice legislation like in our last legislative session? This is actually a piece he wrote back in February of this year. And it starts with a reality check on performance. If the schools were delivering what they had promised to deliver, then nobody would be looking for school choice. I mean, our children would be educated, they would be happy, and there wouldn't be hidden agendas and things like that. But look at the performance of what's taking place. Two telling statistics in Idaho: first in reading and math proficiency for Idaho 8th graders on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's the NAEP tests. They were at 32 and 28% in 2003 rather. 19 years later, those same numbers yielded just 32% and again 32% proficiency. In other words, nearly zero progress. How about that? 2 decades to pump up those rookie numbers. And it didn't happen. The raw numbers are startling, says Ron. This dismal outcome reveals 15,983 third graders who cannot read at grade level, leaving only 7,521 who can. Second, he says, let's consider the record on spending. Could it be that schools just need more resources? Since 2003, K through 12 education spending in Idaho has increased from $986 million to over $3.2 billion with a B in 2022. We've tripled state spending on schools and education, yet we've seen school performance, or student performance rather, go nowhere. Does that seem like a good return on investment for the money that was spent? And yet still, oh, we need more money. The students deserve more. Now, he says the reluctance of the legislature to act on choice is puzzling when you look at the often disappointing school performance. Spending on the rise, doubling in the last 10 years, the woke agenda increasing. Have you seen some of the books they use? And parents' estimation of their schools is very low. But the reluctance of the legislature, rather, is not puzzling when you look at the composition of how the legislature thinks. Ranking mostly Democrat and their fear of offending one of the biggest lobbies in Boise, that being the teachers' union lobby. Now, to be clear, he says it's not necessarily the legislature as a whole that's the problem. Many bills never see the light of day or get a vote because so-called legislative leaders try to protect their committees and their legislative bodies from uncomfortable votes and the less than stellar results. I mean, can we safely say Idaho taxpayers deserve better? Because they're the ones footing this bill. So school choice is something that could very likely happen, and for good reasons. Again, this is not to condemn all public school personnel. It's not to condemn all public schools. But clearly something there is causing greater emphasis to be placed on the system rather than on what is going on for the students. And that is not a good thing. So one other note here from Ron Nate. He says, here's what Idaho parents get for their education dollar. Poor results, higher costs, hidden agendas, and the product is nothing close to what they want. There is no school choice unless, of course, they're willing to fork out private school tuition on top of the taxes they already pay for free, that's a good place for the air quotes, public education. Now, that's not freedom. That's not competition. And that's not fair. The legislature needs to admit public education's failures and stop scamming parents and taxpayers. And here's why we have actual hope that in the next legislative session, there's a good chance that's finally going to happen, or at least the beginnings will happen. Ron says, if you're supportive of allowing money to follow children to their best education possibilities, the primary election that we just had in May will not disappoint. Key opponents to school choice lost their re-election bids: Senators Winder, Hartgen, Schroeder, and Representatives Yamamoto, Bundy, Roten, and Durant. In their places are strong conservatives who value the best education choices possible. Look, I understand that, look, my wife teaches public school, so I'm not going to sit here and condemn all public schools are terrible places and the people in them are terrible people. But the origins of the system itself were not to create free thinkers or people who prize freedom above all else. They were to create obedient citizens who pretty much think the same thing about the issues. And if you think that's a good thing, well, congratulations. But uniformity is not a symptom of freedom. And that's what we were founded on. That's the prime directive on which this nation was founded. Individual liberty, the ability to pursue happiness in your own way. So it looks like we have some more freedom-minded legislators that are bringing it to the table. It'll be interesting to see not only how it shakes out, but exactly who will push back and how they plan to do it. Just understand, there are people like Audrey Dutton who are serving as narrative managers and there to defend, the system as it is. Hopefully it's a little bit easier to see through some of their chicanery and to think for yourself about why people would want school choice. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or Bias All Media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is in